Good morning. Good morning to you all from Toronto, Canada. I am so sorry that I cannot be with you in person. I not only enjoy my time in the Philippines, but I always learn new ideas and teaching perspectives from them. So many dedicated teachers and faculty members and education leaders across the Philippines. Uh, Thank you, President Speke, for the kind introduction. And before I begin my presentation, I also want to thank the Philippine Association for Teachers and Educators for inviting me to speak at this conference. It's indeed an honor, and I appreciate the invitation very, very much. You know, as we now return from the great disruption to schooling brought on by COVID, there is an opportunity to rethink what should, what could, and what must change. And equally important to accompanying what must change, of course, is how. How will the change take place? So I would like to share some thoughts in both this post-COVID context and also in the light of the recent opening of the United Nations, where the world leaders acknowledged the United Nations Secretary General's calling for education transformation and his placing education at the very center of the entire global sustainability discussions. So let me put up some accompanying slides that hopefully will help me share my thoughts on these important education issues. Your themes of inclusivity, of equity, education quality, embedded in the overarching issue of sustainability that's highlighted in your conference. You know, you're addressing these is especially relevant as these issues are also, being revisited and decisions are being made all around the world now, especially in this post-COVID and UN context. So let me continue on this theme of change, but with so many students falling behind due to no fault of their own, let's look at change and an approach through humor in teachers. I love this. If you can read this notice of time for change, thank a teacher, right? I think you probably have seen this or a version of this at some point. But the phonetically spelled message of a primary student, if you can read this, you probably are a teacher, right? It's, of course, humorous. I'm sure every primary teacher or even parent recognizes this, likely a daily occurrence. But in the context of your conference, what if this isn't a primary teacher and this is the writing, the sincere writing of a 14-year-old? You see, this is where inclusivity and equity must enter the picture. What if this is an adult? Where is the adult education and the SDG call for lifelong learning? Where is that arise? But let's look at what is changing regarding the very purpose of education. Much of it already underway, even before COVID, but picking up speed now. I want to share some ideas from Dr. Zul Razak. He's president of the International Islamic University of Malaysia, on a fundamental philosophical change to the underpinnings and the very purpose of education.
From my point of view, when we talk about the future, we want better human beings. In our case, we call it humanizing education. In other words, how do you train people to be better human beings in trying to manage their world and also the world outside? So we talk about education in that particular context as a holistic education. Many a times we talk about transdisciplinary, inclusiveness, integration. This to me is about how do you create a total human person. And I said, I agree with you in the sense that when we talk about education today, it is totally fragmented. And more often than not, it is about an economic drive. Hence, you have the word human capital, for example. Human capital do not necessarily mean a good human being. And we want to go back to this whole idea, who is this human being? And I think it's already being spelled in many of the UNESCO sort of document. I remember the 4 pillars of learning. We have what learning to be. Learning to be is about creating that human person. In fact, the word that used in human to be is to create a complete human person. And we are very far from creating this complete human person. So this trying to attempt to make this work is to go back. And once you get this complete human person, then it is possible to envisage a complete institution using the holistic sort of approach. The approach must be holistic in the sense that it cannot be compartmentalized. Many a times, I think when you want to make change, we do it piecemeal. And oftentimes it doesn't work because we cannot connect it together. And the approach that we took, or we want to take at least, is to look at the whole institution approach. And the whole institution approach will have to depend on the whole person approach. And this is where I think your SDG comes in, when you try to connect the dots. The 14 dots, the 17 dots, it could be more than 17 dots. We discover this as we go along. For example, in our case, we're thinking of where is spirituality in this? We're beginning to envisage and reimagine the SDG 18 to talk about spirituality, because that's the binding sort of glue between us human beings. Everything else fails, spirituality will probably bind us together. So these are issues that I think will bring back to what education is all about. Once we are able to move the institution in a holistic manner, then we can envisage and see whether we can also move the society in a holistic manner. And hence we have the integration between society and university as a whole, no longer two separate things. The university goes on its way, the community goes on its way, and when the pandemic comes, you find this thing gets disrupted very easily.
Yeah. Now, Zul is talking in the context of a university, but what could transfer from that concept to that of schools, right? With elementary, secondary, and so on. Now, Zul also mentioned the 4 pillars. The 4 came out in 1996 by UNESCO. It was referred to learning, the treasure within. And these 4 are to know, to do, to be, and to live together. These are the 4 purposes of education, but they change over time, right? So to know means also now to be aware of what we don't know and what are the implications, right? And where do we get our knowledge from? Is it only the peer-reviewed journals largely from the North, right? The traditional knowledge, is that worth knowing? And to do it ethically, right? To ensure that others can also be, so that you live and do it in an ethical manner. And living together, learning together with others, where others is not limited to humans, but all forms of life, and living together, of course, sustainably. Now, the UN is looking at what is the role of education in a more sustainable future. And in the 2030 agenda, embedded or that surrounds the Sustainable Development Goals, it outlines 7 different targets of looking at the role of education and moving from free education to grade 6 to, in this first one, to include secondary school, and so on. So you see, they outline various things. And 4.5 is to eliminate gender disparities. I'll come back to that again. And 4.7, knowledge and skills for sustainable development. How do we build that in as well? So largely, it is about access and retention in quality education, which is at the heart of your school. But as I say, it's not SDG 4 saying to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education. That's in the overall chapeau, and promote lifelong learning opportunities for 4. But that 4.5 that I mentioned, you see, to eliminate gender disparities in education and ensure equal access and so on for the vulnerable, which would include those who are learning disabled, right? And indigenous peoples and people, children living in vulnerable situations, in poverty and without both parents. If we look at 4.7, then this is where we talk about education for sustainable development, about human rights, gender equality, culture of peace, and the whole concept of global citizenship, which is what I will come back to in all. And the idea that your conference is talking about these very things, I think is more very, very commendable. Now, it'll keep mentioning about education. And of course, education, this is not the first time. Education has been part of all three of the sustainability implementation plans. As you know, the Sustainable Development Goals is the third. The first being Agenda 21 that went from 1990, 92 actually, through until the year 2000, because just before sustainability was endorsed in the implementation plan of Agenda 21 in 1992, educators were already out front and had developed education for all in 1990. In 2000, we had the Millennium Development Goals, where again, education was a key element of the 8 targets. And now in 2015, again, education is there. And so the idea that education is central to all of this is extremely important. But it keeps mentioning education for sustainable development. And it not only is this a key element in SDG 4, but the United Nations General Assembly, under the lead of the Secretary General, as I say, it reaffirms that education for sustainable development, not necessarily just education, but education for sustainable development, is a vital means of implementation of sustainable development. It's an integral element of Goal 4, but a key enabler of all of the Sustainable Development Goals. So what is education for sustainable development? Well, just in the context, I want to assure that it's not another discipline we have to squeeze into an already overcrowded curriculum, right? But it is a way of thinking of it as an outcome of our education. It's a purpose of our education. It's embedded at all grade levels and wherever possible through all of the various disciplines. It's also a learning approach. We must model it in our schools, in the way we address social justice and social issues, environmental concerns, and economic justice as we're working through. So this is basically what we are talking about. And just as the United Nations has the Sustainable Development Goals as their roadmap, their way forward, and so on, UNESCO has also produced an ESD parallel, a roadmap that focuses on 5 priority areas. The first being advancing policy, which will not only enable, but will fund schools and universities and so on to address sustainability. Second is in transforming our schools. What is taught, how it is taught, what is modeled, what is evaluated, and so on. And building the capacity of teachers to do this, because most of us had received no training prior to this. So how do we go about doing this? And of course, engaging and enabling and working alongside our youth. And the last is how do we expand this out into the entire community? So I just wanted to set this as a foot in this keynote as sort of overarching. We also mentioned global citizenship, And again, I don't say we're going to have to give up our passports and so on, but much more it is developing a sense of not solidarity with others around the world. And again, not limited to humans, but to all life forms, a feeling of responsibility, a feeling of interconnectedness with others. And so these two can work together very, very nicely, because we know in a crowded curriculum that we have in our schools, we can't add all, along with peace education and drug education and all these others. We have to look at a way of embedding it into our existing education. And so we say, we can do them both at the same time. With education for sustainable development, looking at the knowledge and skills of what are the economic, what are the environmental, what are the social threats that are out there. And the global citizenship, developing the willingness to engage and to use this knowledge in informed action, and as well giving our youth the skills to become involved democratically, politically, and to move from simply knowing something to actually being engaged and involving it. So these are sort of the two big levers that we're trying to look at how to bring into it. So we recognize that there's education will change. There are things that we as educators want to change. We want to have better graduation rates and outcomes. We want what we teach to be useful and meaningful and relevant for our graduates throughout their entire life. But we also must be aware what will change anyway, even if we don't act. And probably climate change disasters, the hurricanes, the typhoons, and so on, forced migration due to drought and sort of conflict between groups. There is a wonderful saying from Africa: as the water hole shrinks, the animals look at each other very differently. And so as resources dry up and so on, these are the things that are going to happen, even if we do not do anything. So in light of that, the need for change, UNESCO, and it started in around 2012 to look into the futures of education. They held consultations with over 1 million people all around the world. Groups held their say in what they wanted to see changed in the way of content, delivery, and so on. And it came forward in 2020 with a document called Reimagining Our Futures Together. And what the Secretary General of the United Nations did was he built on that. And he took it and called for the transformation of our education systems, building in the vision of the Secretary General, where Guterres says, any solution to the world's problems starts with education, the greatest tool we have to fulfill and grow human potential. Right? Youth, over 100,000 young people, just a little over 2 weeks ago well, it will be a month ago now, in New York, came forward with a declaration saying, in essence, that they wanted their place at the table. Youth actually make up, in some countries, 50% of the population in African countries. And so where the average age is 16, 17 years old. But if you think of youth up to between 25 and 30, you see they rightfully have a place. And they're saying we're no longer going to sit back, but we want to have a voice. But to have an informed voice, our education systems have to play a role in that. Right? And so we're looking now, countries are coming forward with their statements as what they are going to do to try and bring around this kind of transformation. Now, embedding sustainability in this future transformation, what would be things that could be there? And so we look at the idea of prevention. How can we use education to become look out and see what are the threats that are out there? Okay. What is likely coming? And to try and come up with ways of preventing it. If we know, for instance, that there is going to be immigration from very different culture in large forms, how do we actually begin to change things in their country so they won't have to leave? Or in mitigation, the second one is, how do we begin to prepare so that when they do arrive, we won't have conflict, right? How can we prepare things to make it easier for them and for ourselves? Or we could even go so far as to look at how we could make use and take advantage of these people coming in. In Canada, we realized at a time when we would be having mass migrations from other than Europe, that Africa, Southeast Asia, and so on would be coming. And so in our school systems, what we started to do was to really focus on anti-racism, on cultural understanding, this sort of aspect in the forms of mitigation. In the form of adaptation, what we are doing is building the respect for Philippine healthcare workers and Philippine educators, so that when the Philippine people are arriving in Canada, they are welcome and respected and so on. So how do we try to anticipate what we think is going to be happening? If we look at how do we build in equity and inclusivity into our transformation, what we need to do is to look at what are the issues that are out there now. So many we learned through COVID times, the access to the internet was very unjust, with some young people having their own bedroom, good access to the internet, their own equipment, and so on, and the coaching of parents, and they did very, very well, right? But that was not true with everyone. We have the rising issue now of early school leavers now being more boys than girls. What kinds of programs are we going to try and come up with that will address this issue? In universities in much of the world, girls outnumber boys, or young women outnumber young men. Right? But how are we going to bring around affirmative action program for men? I mean, it is something that we need to think about. Do we need these programs, or are there mediation shifts that we can make right now in our schooling? And of course, we can go down the whole list of things that where equity and inclusivity are problems or are issues. Now, we know, for instance, the issue, I know in the Philippines, very concerned with your indigenous peoples. And we had universities from the Philippines involved in our research into how education for sustainable development, it could perhaps improve the lives and the education of Indigenous youth. And in our findings, we realized, for instance, that Indigenous parents and Indigenous students themselves and their elders, they wanted the life of their young people to be even better than their own. And they realized that they needed 21st century competencies. They didn't want them to forget their own culture and who they were as a people, but they also wanted the 21st century competencies. They wanted the systemic strengthening of technical and vocational training, and I'll come back to that. They wanted their own Indigenous perspectives embedded in teacher certification and teacher quality teaching, right? So if we look at this from a mitigation and adaptation perspective, what we need to do is to look at how we actually teach to make it relevant. How do we bring in Indigenous perspectives? And how do we learn from the perspectives of Indigenous people in a context of our own search for a sustainable future? It is all relevant and linked together, right? So if we think about this transformation, we also need to think of it in very broad terms that I hope you'll discuss and think about in your conference and beyond. This is not just UNESCO. The OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the people who bring you PISA scores, right? They are talking about shifting from really a focus on math, language, and science to encompass much more, almost along the lines of President Zul Razak's idea of, a more humanistic approach for the individual. They're saying that the goal is largely well-being. And so they have a program, well-being for 2030. What does well-being really mean? Bringing meaningfulness to one's life. Yes, being able to get your Maslowian needs met and to have a reasonable vocation and job and income and so on. But there's more to life than that. And so they recognize that math, language, science, these are all extremely important tools to have in our life. And they should be as sharp as they possibly can be. But the big picture is, what do we build with them? What do we become? If we are to be, what do we use these tools for? So the idea of the tools of math, language, science, and geography, history, and so on, these are tools that we have in our basket. But what do we do with them? Where do we talk about this in our schools, in our education systems? And so they are talking also about transformation. And they look at the steps in transformation as follows. First of all, there is the acquisition of knowledge and information, where the learners become aware of the realities. Right? And then secondly, though, they think about these, they ponder them. There is a critical analysis of how these things fit together. Right? Why do things, let's take an environmental issue. Why does it exist? How big is it? Where did it come from? Who benefits from this? What would be the change that you would recommend? Who would be the new people who benefit from that change? And what would today's existing benefactors, what would they do to retaliate? What kinds of new problems would your solution create? So this whole critical analysis. And then the experience, getting in. It's not just a head thing, it's a hands and a heart. Right? It's becoming engaged in the whole thing. This is something that is really a change, to bring an experiential component to education and developing the connection with the heart and so on. That's the fourth one, the compassion, right? So that there's not only meaningfulness, but there is engagement in the whole thing. And this is set then to move forward forever, gaining knowledge, gaining insight, gaining expertise. And you can see how the need for the ESD and the global citizenship education really comes together and works. Inform and empower, and then engage and evaluate and so on. Much of what we want to do in schools. Another role that is desperately needed is for educators to be able to take the big idea of the Sustainable Development Goals and localize them, bring them down into sustainability issues in their own community so that they have a sense of scale, scope. There's something that students can actually do and accomplish, so that they are not just put out as a great fear, but put out in a sense of being able to do something and manage it. So the three big areas of environment, social, and economic, look at what are these kinds of issues that are there in their own community, and sort of develop their own. Have the young people develop their own sustainability goals and their own targets and so on, and work on them in an age and a capability related way. So how can we use these real issues as a way of delivering the curriculum that we want to deliver, that are the curriculum that's needed by the students and so on, but also in a way that they will develop other skills that will be useful to them throughout their entire life. Ways of organizing, ways of communicating, ways of developing the poise and the ability to present themselves. All of these are parts of a broader education perspective that is really useful, right? So there are different ways of getting started in our schools. Unfortunately, some start at that bottom and just ignore it and say, I've got to work on something else. But in some schools, they bring in clubs and so on. Some simply teach about the sustainable developments in math or in geography or whatever. But what we're trying to do is to move beyond that and reorienting our teaching so it's not about, but for sustainable development. It's about giving them the ability to actually engage and address and to bring about change in the operation of the schools and so on. And even in many situations, they are embedding these in relationships with the local community and doing work with the local council and community organizations and groups. Now, of course, the big issue, the big problem is, are the teachers really ready for this? In a survey that was just put out by Education International and UNESCO, we found that many teachers not only had no training in any of this, but felt pretty uncomfortable in doing it. So you can see the idea that between those who are not ready and those who are only moderately ready, More than 50% of teachers felt they weren't there. So this is up to two things. Again, one, a responsibility of the educator as a professional to try to come up to speed, whether it's individually or in groups or whatever, and the other for our school systems to engage and to seek out the knowledge that will be needed by the teachers, and to provide learning circles where teachers can come together. It may be within your own school, or it may be between schools, so that they receive the kind of training and support that is needed. Globally, they've held basically 1 in 4 are not ready to really talk about human rights or gender equality. You know, these are things where I say we really need to provide help. And these were recommendations from the gathering of the 5th UNESCO Forum on ESD and GCED. You can see them that are there to really even build on the whole school to whole community, mainstream things, and help teachers co-create the pedagogy and the materials and the monitoring mechanisms and so on. But what we usually do is start small, build on your strengths. If your strength is mathematics or your strength is language arts, it's how could you use your strengths and slowly bring in concept of sustainability, whether it's in the readings in your language program or in your language arts program, where to find information, or developing their oral skills of being able to present and talk about their feelings and so on, and slowly build the individual within your classroom, but then work with a committee, slowly start to bring about the change. So eventually we have what we call a whole school approach. Right? So the strength model is so important. We often refer to it as a whole institution approach. This is taken largely from a TVET approach, where we have implementing developing a plan and the various steps, sort of understanding what sustainability is, and then moving on through. At our own institution at York, we've developed the whole institution approach, where we talk about what are we already doing in 21st century learning and so on, and building that, but then starting to look, what is the knowledge that will be needed in the future, and how can we teach this and develop it so that the whole thing is seen as successful. How can we then build upon ourselves for global engagement and so on? But we build it into the campuses, we outreach into the community and so on. And if you're interested at all, please look up York's academic plan from 2020 to 2025. A wonderful story is this. It came out from India, of a little girl in grade 4 who was being taught about her ecological footprint. Right? She was, you can imagine the ecological footprint of a little girl in grade 4. But at any rate, in the balloons showing how many planets we would need if everyone lived the way people in North America lived and so on. And the little girl said, but I have hands. I can do something about my footprints. I can overcome them. And so the whole concept came forward. The teacher recognized the power of that metaphor, the ecological handprint, sort of eradicating her ecological footprint. But it didn't stay there because, I mean, teachers all over the world draw the hand and color them and so on. She took it to a non-government organization called the Center for Environmental Education, who realized the metaphor's power. They built on it and took it to the Ministry of the Environment in India. It spread throughout India, and it's spread to Africa, and it's spreading through much of the world. And they now have developed a teacher's handbook that has come forward, and to how to address the various sustainable development goals, how to enhance the handprints of our young people. And so what I'm hoping is that these ideas that I have sort of shared with you, I hope that they will be of use. And I thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of your conference. I wish you the greatest success, and I wish you, may your handprints going forward be greater than your footprints. Thank you so much. Bye.